Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kennedi Roberts. Today I'm here to talk about something very important. I'm here to talk about the murdered and missing Indigenous woman epidemic that has been happening for over 20 years and is still an issue happening today. We need to do something about this issue, and that's why I'm here making this video. This video is a call to action for every individual who watches this video to step up and become an ally to the Indigenous community, as well as call out the government on their neglect to the Indigenous community. Women are being murdered and going missing, and people are seeing it as an Indigenous issue. No, this is a human issue. We need to protect our women, period. I created a Google survey asking various questions about what people know about the murdered and missing women's epidemic. And also, do they want to become an ally to the community? What do they know about injustices Indigenous people have faced, and things like that. I had 106 people take my survey. And the first question on my survey was simply, do you know about the murdered and missing Indigenous women epidemic? 44% said yes, and 56% said no. If you aren't educated about something, you can't really advocate on it because you don't know what needs to be done, what's going on, what the issue is at hand. So the first thing I'm going to do in this video is just break down kind of the history of what has been happening with murdered and missing Indigenous women and how we've gotten to where we've gotten today. I've done a lot of research for this because I wanted to be very educated on the topic. And so the first article that I read and I thought was a really well written and really amazing article was called Forever Loved: Exposing the Crisis of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women in Canada. And so this article was specifically focusing on Canada, and Canada is where a large majority of these women are going missing. Alright, so to start with some of this history, in 2004, the Sisters in Spirit campaign was launched to bring attention to the violence perpetuated against Indigenous women. They were given $5 million, $5 for each year that they were going to do the Sisters in Spirit campaign. And there were also two major events happening during this time that kind of also brought awareness to murdered and missing Indigenous women. The first was the notorious Canadian serial killer Robert Rickton. He killed over 26 women, and it is said that he actually confessed to killing 49 women, but he was convicted for murdering 26. And the thing about him was a large majority of the women that he murdered were Indigenous women. The other thing that brought awareness to murdered and missing Indigenous women in this time was the Highway of Tears, and kind of, people starting to be aware of what the Highway of Tears was. And basically, the Highway of Tears was Highway 16 in northern British Columbia. This was a highway that many Indigenous women went missing on, or their bodies were found on the side of. And there's actually a couple Indigenous communities and reservations around this area, and that's why it's called the Highway of Tears, because people are taken and they're traveling this highway and they never come back. These three things, the Sisters in Spirit campaign, the Robert Rickton case, and the Highway of Tears, all brought attention to what these women were facing, as well as brought attention to what Indigenous communities in general were facing, as far as reservations, unemployment, poverty, and health issues. And so the government was being criticized heavily. And basically what they did to kind of get the pointer off their back is they said, oh look, we're giving all this money to the Sisters in Spirit campaign. And so the campaign was almost used as an out when the other issues that Indigenous communities were facing were pointed out. They just said, oh look, we're actually, we're helping y'all a little bit, we're doing, but it's not enough. Just because you're helping one issue doesn't mean you shouldn't be helping all of them. And so what's surprising is, after 5 years of this campaign, after the $5 million were used in the Sisters in Spirit campaign, the government stopped all the funding. And so they stopped all the funding for that, but also it affected many other, women's organizations and nonprofit organizations as well. So Sisters in Spirit campaign was not the only thing affected. It affected many other campaigns that were helping women and helping Indigenous women. Next, in 2011, a standing committee on the status of women released a report on violence against Indigenous women. This was a good report because it called on the need for a comprehensive approach to eliminating the violence that all of these Indigenous women were facing. So this report recognized the root causes for the violence that these women were facing, and they identified it as poverty, racism, the colonial history of Canada, and systemic police failure. And these were the things that were contributing to the violence these people faced and the root causes of it. The main point of this approach was to point out that we can't deal with violence against Indigenous women without looking at the systematic reasons that it's happening, and that the system is making these women vulnerable to the violence that they are facing. When they released the final report, all of the root causes were left out of the report, and they didn't release that. The government refused to give a national action plan to how they were going to fix the violence that Indigenous women were facing. So not only did they leave out the root causes, but they also said, okay, but we're actually not going to set any type of action plan into, helping these women and getting them out of this situation. We're not going to look at the systematic implications, nor are we going to address them. And as you can imagine, as I would be, that made a lot of folks mad. And it really pushed all of this work onto non-governmental organizations and the community itself to say, you guys have to fix this issue that we created. That's not fair. In 2013, a New York-based international non-governmental organization started researching into missing and murdered Indigenous women. They released a report called "Those Who Take Us Away: Abusive Policing and Failures in Protection of Indigenous Women and Girls in Northern British Columbia." This report documented the ongoing failure of police to protect Indigenous women and also the acts that the police perpetrated onto these Indigenous women themselves. As you can think, people who are being abused by the police are not going to go to the police for help. And that's also how this cycle keeps going, because the police either do not deal with these situations correctly, do not deal with missing and murdered women correctly, do not send out Amber Alerts and things like that, or two, they are perpetuating these acts onto these women in their communities. Which, why would you reach out to the police if you know the police are the ones abusing you and you know they're not going to do anything because they've never done anything? So all of these things that I've told you about the police failure, about the systematic issues, about the violence being perpetrated onto these women, are things that were also confirmed and accepted by the Indigenous community and non-governmental organizations working inside of these communities. Calls of action have been occurring since 2004. It's 2020. That's 16 years. 16 years of women going missing and nobody's saying anything about it. 16 years, not even 16, more than 16 years, because this report, there are already women going missing. More than 16 years of people forgetting about the Indigenous community. People not even forgetting. People not caring about the Indigenous community, letting these women go missing. The government not setting in any direct action plans. The government failing to look at the systematic issues that perpetrates this violence onto its women. The system they created, that's why they don't want to acknowledge it. And so, now it's 2020. Justin Trudeau has said, I want to bring justice. I don't want to hurt Indigenous communities anymore. But he has failed to bring a true action plan into how he's going to stop the violence perpetrated onto these women and the murders happening to these women. So when it comes to the government, they're not really a lot of help to the community, and that's why it's falling onto these community members, falling onto the Indigenous community themselves. And why this cycle continues, because they can't do it all by themselves. They need support. The government needs to change the systems that it set in place to marginalize this community. So touching back down to the Highway of Tears, I watched a Vice documentary on YouTube called Searchers Highway of Tears. And basically, the documentary was about an ex-cop, a white man, an ex-cop named Ray. And he was helping families, he became a private investigator and started helping these Indigenous communities try to find, who killed their loved ones, trying to figure out who was committing all these crimes onto these women. And so he was telling a lot of stories about what he's been doing over the years. And surprisingly enough, his main way he tries to figure out, who did what and what happened, he straight up and goes and asks the people who he thinks did it. Did you murder this person? And that's how he tries to get his answers. One time when he was first beginning, he called one of the policemen he used to work for, and he's like, okay, I'm going to start looking into these cases. And he said, sir, you can't look into these cases. You will be charged with obstruction of justice. I mean, truly, the obstruction of justice charge was a threat so he wouldn't look into these cases. All these cases are open, and you're not looking into them. They're just open, cold cases. So why wouldn't somebody want to help these families? Why wouldn't this man be allowed to help these families as a private investigator? It's not making sense. And so one particularly heartbreaking story I heard in this documentary, there was this woman, an Indigenous woman, who had lost her sister, and her sister is missing. And they were at a bar one night. Her sister was going to a party with her friends. She was like, okay, I'm about to go with you guys. She turns around to get her drink, turns back around, and her sister is gone. And that was the last day that she saw her sister. She had been working with Ray. And basically she knows who killed her sister, but the police aren't taking her suggestions, and it's a cold case. There's nobody has been arrested for the murder of her sister. And she just lives with a lot of regret, because she feels like if, she would have done something in the moment or seen where she was going and not turned around, then her sister would still be alive. And so these are the type of heartbreaking stories that many families have never getting justice for their loved ones, you know, never understanding what happened to their loved ones. And these cases are open and they're never just brought the justice and the closure that they deserve. Another kind of documentary video I watched was a video, Canada's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, by AG+. It started the video talking a lot about how, you know, Canada has been shamed by the United Nations because of how they're not dealing with this situation and how this epidemic is happening, and they're not doing much about it. And as I said, Justin Trudeau claims he wants to do all this work and help the Indigenous community, and it doesn't seem like he's willing to do the systemic work to help these communities. The video goes into then talking about a specific place in Canada called Winnipeg, Manitoba, one of the most violent cities in Canada. It also has one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in North America. More Indigenous women have been murdered and gone missing in Winnipeg than in any other place. So a particularly heartbreaking story was that of Tina Fontaine. She was a 15-year-old girl. She was a part of the Saging First Nations tribe. Her body was found wrapped in plastic and in a duvet cover in the Red River. Her case really opened the world's eyes about, you know, the violence that Indigenous women are facing, especially because she was so young and she was killed. And it was a tragic story, and it was something that should have never happened in the first place. And so to kind of connect this back to, you know, the community work, the work that the community is doing that the police should be doing, the Red River is notorious for, you know, bodies being dumped in there, and a lot of people think their family members are at the bottom of the river. And so a group of community members spend their free time sweeping the bottom of the river, hoping to pull up any body parts, any ways to identify these murdered and missing individuals. And it's very heartbreaking because, you know, you never know what they're gonna pull up. They never know what they're gonna pull up out the river. This woman who was on the boat, she goes out there every day and wonders, will she pull up her missing sister out of the river? I cannot imagine what that is like. I cannot imagine sweeping the bottom of a river for one of my loved ones. Like, sit there and think about that. You get on a boat and you sweep the river, hoping to find closure, hoping to find somebody's missing family member. I cannot imagine. Activists are stepping up big time for these issues, holding marches in their community, doing community events to bring the community together instead of split them up. Walking at night, at midnight, letting these women who have been abducted or whose bodies are being used, letting them know that they're not alone, walking the night, singing for them. They're doing the things that the police should be doing, searching, supporting their community. And so now I'm gonna go a little bit more back into, you know, to the survey that I created, why I chose the questions I chose, and kind of explaining further my research through my survey. The second question I asked people is, if they did hear about the murdered and missing Indigenous women epidemic, where did they hear about it? And a significant amount of my results were they heard about it on social media. And that was 70% of people who knew about it heard about it on social media. 10.6 of people who heard about it heard it through word of mouth, you know, having regular conversations with people. Maybe somebody was, you know, talking about it, and others heard about it at school, from the news, and things like that. And so I chose this question to see, you know, what is the best way to get the word out about this? And I'm glad I'm posting this on YouTube because that's social media. And hopefully a lot more people will be educated on the murdered and missing Indigenous women epidemic because I posted this on social media. My next question was, do you know anybody who has been affected by the murdered and missing Indigenous women epidemic? 94% said no, and 6% said yes. So obviously a large amount of the people who took my survey were outside of the Indigenous community. And I actually purposely wanted to choose people who are not in the Indigenous community to take my survey because I was thinking about maybe, you know, interviewing people who have been affected by this, but that just doesn't sit right with my soul because I feel as though I should not be going into their community and trying to, you know, get information about their traumas that they have experienced for, I mean, a YouTube video. I believe that is their experiences to keep. If they want to share that, they will and they can willingly, but I just did not feel comfortable going into their community, taking their information and stepping back out to make my video. And even though I am spreading awareness for this and trying to get people to be involved, I still felt like that was not the right thing to do. And so through kind of like assuming that most people would have heard about this through social media and heard about this issue through social media, the next question I asked was, how often do you use social media on a daily basis? 35% of my results said 1 to 3 hours, 32% of my results said 3 to 5 hours, and 24% said 5 to 8 hours. So I mean, It's a kind of varying amount, but I still feel like people are at least on social media, once a day. 1 hour a day, 3 hours a day, 8 hours a day, at different increments. The next question I asked was, how often do you see a post about murdered and missing Indigenous women on your social media? And 65% of my results said rarely / never. So although these people are using social media, they're not really getting information about the Indigenous community and Indigenous issues on their social media. My next question was, do you consider yourself an activist or somebody who fights injustice? 73% of my participants said yes. 26% said no. I asked this question because, activists are more likely, or people who consider themselves activists are more likely to, enact change in these type of issues. No matter what different issues they specifically focus on, they might be more inclined to actually, listen to this and be receptive to what I'm saying and what I'm asking. My next question was, are you educated about the injustices that Indigenous communities have faced throughout history? And so 50% said moderately, 22% said a little bit, 15% said yes, they're very educated on it, and 10% said no, not at all. And so I asked this question to kind of get a gauge on how plugged in are people about, things that have historically happened with Indigenous communities. Because I feel like in school, in our public education system, we learn a little bit about, what Indigenous communities have experienced. We don't learn the truth about Thanksgiving. We don't really learn about how these people were pushed off their land. We were told, oh yeah, they were made deals and treaties and that's how we got the land. It was not like that. And I feel like the truth hasn't been exposed to everybody about what these communities are facing. I think these last two questions were probably the most important questions on my survey. The first was, would you be open to being an ally to the Indigenous community? 86.8% said yes, 12% said maybe, and 1% said no, that's their business. But also, I feel like you should not be an ally if you're not for real about the ally life. Don't be an ally if you're not for real about the ally life. Don't do it for a little performative activism. Don't do it for this, don't do it for that. If you're going to be an ally for real. And my last question was, do you want to know more about how you can support murdered and missing Indigenous women? 94.3% say yes. 5.7% said no, which, again, that's their business. I have nothing to say about that. Next, I'm going to read The Responsibilities of an Ally to the Indigenous Community, written by people in the Indigenous community. I thought this was important because this is a step of action to take, becoming an ally. And I know this issue is really hard because a lot of it is systemic, and that's the reason that these women are facing this violence, and a lot of these things cannot be necessarily undone without governmental action to undo these policies and undo these things that are marginalizing these communities. But you can always be an ally, and you can always support the Indigenous people that you know, people in your life, support the community, donate money to help. You can do all types of things. And I think being an ally is a really big piece. Fighting for their struggles, being on the front lines. I think being on the front lines of protests, truly, I think that is a big thing, because for marginalized communities, being on the front lines, being the people who are getting maced and sprayed at and protecting them is such a big snaps. That is such a big, a good ally act. I'm reading this from the Ally Bill of Responsibilities by Dr. Lynn Gale. Responsible allies. 1. Do not act out of guilt, but rather out of a genuine interest in challenging the larger oppressive power structures. 2. Understand that they are secondary to the Indigenous people and that they are working with and that they seek to serve. They and their needs must take a backseat. 3. Are fully grounded in their own ancestral history and culture. Effective allies must sit in this knowledge and with confidence and pride, otherwise the wannabe syndrome could merely undermine the Indigenous people's efforts. 4. Are aware of their privileges and openly discuss them. This action will serve to challenge larger oppressive power structures. 5. Reflect on and embrace their ignorance of the group's oppression and always hold this ignorance in the forefront of their minds. Otherwise, a lack of awareness of their ignorance could merely perpetuate the Indigenous people's oppression. 6. Are aware of and understand the larger oppressive power structures that serve to hold certain groups of people down. One way to do this is to draw parallels through critically reflecting on their own experiences with oppressive power structures. Reflecting on their subjectivity in this way, they ensure critical thought, or what others call objectivity. In taking this approach, these parallels will serve to ensure that non-Indigenous allies are not perpetuating this oppression. 7. Constantly listen and reflect through the medium of subjectivity and critical thought versus merely their subjectivity. This will serve to ensure that they avoid the trap that they or their personal friends know what is best. This act will also serve to avoid the trap of naively following a leader, or for that matter, of a group of leaders. 8. Strive to remain critical thinkers and seek out knowledge and wisdom of the critical thinkers in the group. Allies cannot assume that all people are critical thinkers and have a good understanding of the larger power structures of oppression. 9. Ensure that a community consensus or understanding has been established in the terms of their role as allies. Otherwise, the efforts of people will be undermined due to a lack of consultation and agreement. 10. Ensure that the needs of the most oppressed, women, children, elderly, young teenage girls and boys, and the disabled, are served in the effort or movement that they are supporting. Otherwise, they may engage in a process that is inadequate and thus merely serving to fortify the larger power structures of oppression. Alternatively, their good intentions may not serve those who need the effort most. Rather, they may be making the oppression worse. 11. Understand and reflect on the prevalence and dynamics of lateral oppression and horizontal violence on and within oppressed groups and the components of the group, such as women, and seek to ensure that their actions do not encourage it. 12. To ensure that they are supporting a leaders group of leaders, or a movement's efforts that serve the needs of the people. For example, do the community people find this leader's efforts useful, interesting, engaging, and thus empowering? If not, allies should consider whether the efforts are moving in a questionable or possibly inadequate direction, or worse yet, that their efforts are being manipulated and thus undermined, possibly for economic and political reasons. Understand that sometimes allies are merely manipulatively chosen to further a leader's agenda versus the Indigenous nations, communities, or organizations concerned. When this situation occurs, act accordingly. 14. Do not take up space and resources, physical and financial, of the oppressed group. 15. Do not take up time at community meetings and community events. This is not their place. They must listen more than speak. Allies cannot perceive all the larger oppressive power structures as clearly as the members of the oppressed group can. And finally, 16. Accept the responsibility of learning and reading more about their role as effective allies. And so that was the list of responsibilities that allies hold. Now that you know about this epidemic, about the violence that Indigenous women face, what are you going to do? Are you going to become an ally? Are you going to do your research? Are you going to donate to small organizations or large organizations? Are you going to try to support Indigenous communities in your area? I'm going to leave some resources linked down below as to how you can get involved in helping these communities. I hope you leave this video with more knowledge, and I hope you leave ready to take action and ready to put on your marching boot, get your money out, go contact Indigenous communities and see what they need. Look at the resources down below in the description and make some change. And with that, I will end this video. Thank you all so much for watching. If you liked the video, you could give it a thumbs up. You can share it with people you know. And I will see y'all next time on my channel. Subscribe if you like. I don't know what content I'll be creating next. I was thinking about starting a vlog series or doing something like that. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.